the previous employment section of his CV, my next guest lists soldier, diplomat, charity CEO, award-winning travel writer, Harvard professor, and most recently Britain's top podcaster. But his role as politician is the subject of his new book, Politics on the Edge, which records in full, uncensored fashion the complete omnishambles at the heart of our British political system. Well, making his uncensored debut, I am genuinely delighted to have probably the most liked politician in Britain. But the bar is low, Rory Stewart.
The bar is very low.
Let's start with that, because you've got out of politics. Mm-hmm. Many people, a lot of my family, wish you hadn't, wish you were right in the front line of the thing. Mm. Why did you eventually just say, I'm just done with this?
I met the end with Boris Johnson. I mean, that was the end for me. And I put in a good 9 years. I'd been a cabinet minister. I liked Theresa May. Thought she was trying to do the right thing. But I really thought that Boris Johnson was a dangerous thing. I thought he was a shambolic clown. I thought he was going to be very damaging for our constitution. And
he was.
And I felt he was, yeah.
I mean, that's exactly how he turned out to be. I mean, you were very prescient in your assessment of him, which led you to leave. I guess the problem is, if people like you don't want to stay in our system, it's never going to improve.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it? It's a really difficult balance. You put up with a lot, you work out how much you can put up with, and at some point you have to be like, enough's enough.
You're quite direct about some of our former leaders. Of Theresa May, she had some of a monarch's stiff authority, not necessarily a negative, I guess. David Cameron, later in Kabul, you write, he came across like a host at a pheasant shoot, rented only for the day, courteously presiding without any particular desire to know about the detail of the soil on which he was standing or about the professionals whose job it was to drive the game. I mean, a real picture of superficiality there from that Prime Minister.
Yeah, I thought that when I came in, that one of the things that struck me first, and it's probably something you see a lot, and the public sees a lot, is fundamentally a lack of seriousness. It really has become like a massive campaigning communications game. And there isn't any time really to talk about policy. You would have thought that secretly they might take their masks off and they get around the cabinet table and they're like, OK, enough with going out to the media. What do we really think about this? But it happens so rarely.
I mean, the worst by miles of all your stories, it might be the worst thing I've read in a long time. Liz Truss, and you write this, back in London, Liz Truss asked me how my weekend had been. I explained that my father had died. She paused for a moment, nodded, and asked when my 25-year environment plan would be ready. I read that and I thought, I can't believe I'm reading that. And then I thought, actually, yes, I can believe I'm reading that. Because Liz Truss always exuded an air to me of somebody who probably would behave like that.
Yeah,
without a shred of decency or basic humanity.
No, I think she's a very unique human being. I worked for Liz Truss, I worked for Priti Patel, I worked for Boris Johnson, and it was a real education.
But that moment...
well, that was very sad for me. I mean, obviously, I love my father deeply.
Of course.
And I was... but I think that's more awkwardness. I think she's somebody who...
But that's not awkward. That's just a total lack of basic humanity and manners, isn't it?
I think she's somebody who doesn't relate very easily to other people. And maybe I'm psychologizing too much, but yeah.
Rishi Sunak you call Machiavellian. Why do you call him that?
I think probably because I sensed... I used to sit next to him in the library in the House of Commons, big kind of wooden library, and he was my library partner. So I was quite fond of him. But I didn't quite get why he'd suddenly gone hard for Brexit. And particularly, even when I got round that, and I understand many of my friends voted Brexit, I couldn't get round him getting in behind Boris Johnson so hard. Because he'd seemed to me quite a sort of thoughtful, serious...
He seems the kind of serious guy you're talking about.
Yeah, he does.
But I agree. If I was talking to him, which I do occasionally, the Brexit thing, I didn't understand why he would be that supportive. And I agree about Boris. I guess if Boris is the leader, you either fall in behind or you do what you did and just get out of it, right?
But he fell in behind pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I found it difficult is that it was the MPs who made it possible for Boris. Because if you remember in this leadership contest, you needed the MPs to vote for him first. And basically, there were a whole middle group of MPs, and you'd say to them, we know him very well, we've worked with him, I'd worked with him in the Foreign Office, we know that he doesn't really pay attention, we know he's pretty careless about a lot of stuff. You don't really think he'd be a good Prime Minister, do you? And they'd say, no. So why are you supporting him? And they'd say, because he's going to win.
But hasn't politics always been full of charlatans and unprincipled people. And if we accept that that's a bitter reality, not all, I've met some very decent people in politics, actually, but it's not entirely surprising that people like Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and others, in a televisual age, the ones who can crack a joke and make people laugh,
Sure.
who have a little bit less of the robot about them, and
Sure.
people thought Theresa May was robotic. It's not entirely surprising that they rise to the top and have a constituent that will support that.
No, it's not surprising. Politics always had charlatans and bluffers. And I think we, people like me from the kind of centre ground of politics, have a lot to answer for. I think 2008 financial crisis showed that we'd mismanaged the economy. I think Iraq and Afghanistan were horrible foreign policy humiliations. And so I think people like Trump or Johnson are responding to a genuine public anger. These guys screwed up. They didn't know what they were doing. The problem is what people are choosing to do is throw them like a hand grenade at the system.
But, I mean, in Trump's case, it's effective. He just tears up any rules that have gone before. He doesn't care, and he has a constituent audience that don't really care what he does or what he says.
Yeah, I think it's true for both of them. But I think that to counter that, there's always going to be people like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson around. What's lacking is the seriousness in the kind of middle ranks of politics. And that's why I think the system feels so broken.
What do we do about it? How do we fix it?
I think we have to decentralise. We have to take power out of Westminster. I'm very excited by, the Mayor of Manchester, Mayor of West Midlands, and Mandy Street. And I think we've got to get out of this Victorian idea that a bunch of amateurs sitting in Parliament are going to be able to micromanage the country.
You were a tutor to Prince William and Prince Harry. So what do you feel about what's happened with those two?
So I don't talk about it. It's the one thing
I know, that's why I've asked you.
Yes, it's the one thing
So
I don't
the
talk
show's called Uncensored, Rory. Don't come on here and start self-censoring. What's the matter with you, man?
I think if I'm teaching them, I owe
But
them,
just on a human level.
owe them confidentiality. I like them both very much. They have a lovely
Do
voice.
you feel sad about what's happened? They now hate each other so much they don't even talk to each other.
I definitely feel sad, yeah.
Is that as far as you're going to go?
As far as I'm going to go.
Who was the brighter?
As far as I go.
Well, you were their tutor.
As far as I'm going to go, that's not my job.
From a military perspective, when I watch Harry doing his Invictus Games thing, I think good on you. When I think about his service to his country, I think good on him.
Yeah.
My brother-in-law taught them both at Sandhurst, actually. I thought they were both good soldiers. When I see him, the other half of him, running around the world, trashing his family and the monarchy and everything, I can't stand it.
Yeah, I sympathise a lot of what you're saying. I'm a big supporter of the King. I'm a big supporter of the Prince of Wales. I'm very proud of the royal family, and I think that's very, very sad.
Should he stick to stuff like the Invictus Games and just shut up trashing the royals?
I'm staying out of this one.
You effectively just said you agree.
Huh? I agree with a lot of things you said.
As his former tutor.
You're dragging me too deep.
You'll sell some books here, Rory. Come on, bit of uncensored honesty. Let's take a break. I want to talk to you after the break. It's 9/11 anniversary today. And I want to ask where you were when it happened, but also it prompted you to go on this extraordinary 2-year walk through Afghanistan and other countries. I want to know why you did that, what you learned, what we should all learn perhaps from that period. That's after the break. I'm back with Rory Stewart here, the uniquely popular and liked British political figure. Luis Rubiales, I wanted to ask you about that because everyone's talking about this guy.
And you've managed to get an interview with him.
Yes, so I've got a big interview with him airing tomorrow night. We got the first interview and it was very interesting. He was very open, very frank about it. He said, look, I was an idiot. I shouldn't have done it. What do you feel, though, about him potentially facing a criminal prosecution now for the kiss?
I actually quite sympathise with the lady at the end there
Grace,
who was saying that it's quite possible that the woman at the time might not really have felt very much, but that afterwards you can feel very, very disturbed by it. I mean, look, it's very difficult to judge. Spain, different mores, different cultures, but I think you've got to be pretty careful about that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting sign of the time that it's created such a furore, actually. 9/11, it's the 22nd anniversary today of 9/11. I remember where I was lying on a sofa recovering from back surgery and was supposed to be lying there for 3 weeks. It was about 8 days in. I got a call from the Daily Mirror newsroom. I was the editor. I got straight in my car and drove to Canary Wharf, not even thinking that that might be a target itself. It was the most extraordinary day of my career and obviously horrendous in so many ways. Where were you when it happened?
I was walking across Asia. I'd been walking for about a year and a bit, And I didn't understand what had happened. I met a guy sort of probably a couple of days after 9/11, and he started trying to explain to me in Nepali. He said, you know, it's this tower in America, and this plane hit it, and I thought this guy was crazy. I literally...
So you had no awareness of it at all?
Processing these words, but I was like, it's like he's telling me there's been some sci-fi attack in New York. So it wasn't until the 18th of September I was arrested and accused of being an Al-Qaeda activist up on the Tibetan-Nepali border.
You are the least likely Al-Qaeda activist I probably ever met.
So this is what I said. I said to the policeman, I said, I'm not a very likely Al-Qaeda activist. And he said, that's exactly why I think you are. It was like Inspector Clouseau.
The walk that you were on, and you carried on for a long time, you did 2 years in the end. It's an extraordinary thing to do, to just walk and walk and walk and walk. What was the motivation for that?
I had been briefly a British soldier, then I was a diplomat. And I felt that I was locked behind these embassy walls. And we were getting involved in these other countries. We had no idea what was happening. So I walked across Afghanistan just after 9/11. I walked through the winter of December, January, February, March. Just the Taliban government fell. And it changed my life, changed me as a politician, changed me as a diplomat, because I saw the gap between these villages I was in, where women had not been more than 2 hours walk from their village in their lives, where I could see drugs being traded, people with guns. And then I turn up in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and I hear the British government and the American government saying, every Afghan wants a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And I thought, I can't even translate that into language they understand. So my life was changed. I mean, 9/11 was a horrible event, but it defined the next 10 years of my life. I was in Afghanistan, I was in Iraq, I was working to advise the US government, and I was trying to stand up against what I saw as the madness of how people were responding.
When you see what's going on in Afghanistan now, with the Taliban just obviously taking back full control and oppressing women again in their millions, terrible poverty, what is the answer? I mean, Tobias Ellwood got into hot water for, it was a very clumsy video he put out, but the central message that we should start engaging again with the Taliban. Did you have some sympathy with that?
I did have sympathy with that, because the truth is that when we sanction people like the Taliban, we don't change their behavior. They're not trying to go shopping in Harrods. All you end up doing is punishing the Afghan people. These are some of the poorest people in the world. Very, very difficult to feed themselves over the winter, people selling their own organs to feed themselves. So I think we can find ways of providing assistance to the Afghans without going through the government, and sanctioning the government just makes the area poorer and more unstable.
And when you look at Ukraine, there's a sort of growing sentiment amongst some Republicans, to my surprise, in America, that America should yank the support, spend it at home, not on this latest foreign conflict. What's your view of what's happening there? I mean, do you think Ukraine can win? Is it incumbent on the West to ensure they can win? How far do we get involved?
I fear that Ukraine is getting like the Iran-Iraq war, which dragged on for 8 years. I think we're underestimating Russia's depth and strength and the nationalistic sentiment. I think it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to break through the front lines, and even if they do, I don't think Russia's going away, and I think the threat to Putin isn't from the left, it's from the right.
You tell a story in your book of how, as an MP, you thought about killing yourself over a story of your constituents' trousers that went viral. You gave an interview where you said some of the farmers in the more remote parts of his constituency hold their trousers up with twine. He got picked up and he's accused of being a posh, you are, of being a posh Tory who thinks his voters are country bumpkins.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, looking back at it over 12 years. I can see now that I was completely overreacting. What I'm trying to be honest about, I suppose, is as a new MP coming in, you feel a very special relationship with your constituents. I was very proud of Cumbria. I was very proud of the work I was doing. I said a stupid thing to a journalist, and suddenly it looks like I'm slagging off my own constituents. And I really felt everything had ended. I sort of felt...
It's extraordinary that you would feel it so deeply. I mean, how close did you come to acting on that impulse?
It's the only time in my life I have felt like that. I was walking down the street and I saw a lamppost and I thought, maybe I should hang myself on this lamppost.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the only time in my life, but it was, and I think it shows something.
Because you felt you'd broken that bond of trust with the constituents?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is about the way that you exaggerate relationships with people, but I felt that an MP with their constituents is like a priest or a doctor. You have a very special relationship, and that if you break it, you're breaking your vocation.
You know, I mean, I read it. It was a startling thing to read. I have to say, though, in the context of the point you're trying to make, I do want more politicians to feel that seriousness about that bond of trust with the electorate. Because if you don't have that, if you treat the electorate with the kind of casual triviality that Boris Johnson did, or the recklessness that Liz Truss did, or whatever, I think if you do that, democracy slowly starts to die. And if we don't have a strong democracy in this country, I don't know what we're left with.
Thank you. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book, in Politics on the Edge, is to show, yes, a bit of humour, but above all to demonstrate that there is a big, big problem, that this is no way to run a government, and that we need to reform. We need to reform our electoral system. We need to reform ministers going in and out every couple of months out of their jobs to have a serious country.
And you know what else we need, Rory? We need you back in the game. You may not want to do it, but actually I think you should.
Thank you.
You going to?
I think about it.
It just made you think about it more?
No, it has made me think about it more, and it's made me think that probably the way back in maybe is more local. As I say, I'm very envious of mayors. I thought about running to be an independent for Mayor of London, and that's still something I think about a lot.
Politics on the Edge. It's a fascinating, it's actually a pretty scary book, actually, because you lift the lid off what we all fear is lying underneath in our parliamentary system, and it's got to evolve and it's got to change. We need more people with your intellect and seriousness, I think, than we currently have, and that would help enormously. Rory Stewart, thank you.
Thank you.
And being uncensored.